Hi, my name is Tennyson Stead. I am a working screenwriter and a working script doctor, and welcome to The Right Stuff. This is lesson 2 of our series on writing the rough draft of your screenplay in 5 weeks, and we're going to start writing scene work this week. So, you have the beginning of the film. You have their very first effort to achieve their goal, right? Whatever that goal happens to be. And you know what they're doing when they start exposing themselves to the risk presented by whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish. And just to be clear, when they expose themselves to that risk isn't something that happens to them. That's something they do to themselves as a natural consequence of trying to achieve their goal. If they're going to be fighting a war, then they put themselves on the front lines where they might get shot. You know, they do that to themselves. Every single thing that happens in this film happens because a character makes it happen to themselves in order to achieve whatever it is that they're trying to achieve. And specifically, the protagonist's arc, the things that happen to the protagonist, are all things that the protagonist puts themselves through in some way, shape, or form. So we're gonna dial that in more specifically as we go through this process. So you know the beginning of the film, you know the end of Act 1, the beginning of Act 2. The first step in writing Act 1 is to make a list of all the things that your protagonist needs to do in order to move their efforts and move their goal from the very first thing that they need to do to the point where they have no choice but to expose themselves to the risk. If they're going to war, what do they need? Do they need, like we said, do they need intelligence? Do they need weapons? Do they need teammates? They need to go get those things. But once they've gathered all the resources, there's nothing left to do but put themselves on the front lines. You want to make an exhaustive list of everything that your character needs to accomplish to create the circumstance where pushing this goal to the next level is the only option left available to them. Okay? But there's a catch. We talked in the prelude about the idea that audiences watch effort. It's the effort that pulls people in. The relationship between an actor and an audience member is the bystander effect. Okay? So, the only things that your character needs to be doing on screen are the challenging things. And when I say challenging, this is a very easy concept for writers to misunderstand, right? I mean challenging in the mechanical sense. I mean things requiring effort. If something is emotionally disturbing or sad or evocative in some way, that does not make it challenging. Just because something is difficult to reckon with, in other words, that does not make it challenging. I'm not talking about internal challenge. I'm talking about external challenge. Okay? The only things that need to be on this list of stuff that your character needs to achieve are the things that are probably not going to work and that your character has to force to work. If there's a piece of information that they need to get, and it's going to be really hard to get because the person who has it needs to keep it a secret for reasons of their own, getting that information is going to be hard. And we can watch the character try to get that information. There's a difference between an audience that's watching and an audience that's waiting for something to happen. If a character goes into a scene and they don't really have to work to get a given piece of information, we're just waiting for them to get the information so we can find out what the scene is there to tell us. We're just waiting for something to happen. But if a character goes into a scene because they need to get a piece of information that they're probably not going to get, then they're going to have to be very resourceful in trying to achieve their goal. And the more resourceful they are, the more the character who's trying to keep the secret has to work to try and achieve their goal in turn. The key is to not let that secondary character in the scene react to the protagonist. They need to have a big picture goal that they're trying to achieve. Keeping the secret is just part and parcel to whatever it is that they're trying to do. So maybe the protagonist will find a way to give them what they want, right? But you don't want to engineer opportunities for the protagonist to succeed. I'm just saying, let each individual character have a goal of their own. If the protagonist can ferret that goal out of them and find a way to use it to their advantage, that's going to feel organic. But if you go ahead and you create a character with like a lock to pick built into their being so that the protagonist can crack the code and get what they're looking for, do not create puzzles for your protagonist to solve. In other words, just let characters have their actions and go into a scene trying to achieve their goals, and make it your protagonist's job, not your job as the writer, to resolve that conflict. Okay? So when I say a goal needs to be challenging, when I say a task needs to be challenging, I'm not saying it needs to be emotionally compelling in some way. I'm not saying it's intellectually a lot. I'm not saying any of that. I'm saying it's probably not going to work, and the protagonist has to make it work. That's it. Okay? So one of the questions that very naturally comes up throughout this process is, if we are not sort of presenting the protagonist with these very emotionally disturbing or shattering pieces of information so that we can gather reactions, how are we ever going to learn about the character's internal life? How are we ever going to expose who this person is? That's a good question. If a character, like the protagonist, is always forced to expend resources, if they are always reaching as deep as they can to achieve whatever it is that they're trying to achieve, then we are going to get to know their toolbox pretty well. They're going to use every single relationship they have in the pursuit of their goal, which means we're going to wind up meeting everyone that they think they can rely on, at least in this situation. And we're going to see what those relationships are worth and how they work, because the protagonist is going to push those relationships to the breaking point. So in the beginning of this process, I said that all of that information, all of the emotional context, all the context is going to be subtext. It's going to be, if you just let it be. You don't have to establish anything. We're going to find out how hard the protagonist's goal is because of how hard they're working to achieve it. We're going to find out who they're friends with and who they know, because they're going to have to go and get all the help that they can possibly get to achieve their goal. And we're going to find out. We're going to come to understand how this protagonist works, because they're going to throw everything in the kitchen sink at the problems that they're trying to solve. If they're a good listener, they're going to have to listen as hard as they can. If they're funny, they're going to use their sense of humor to try and achieve to try and get people on their side. They're going to use everything they've got. If they have a relationship with someone that they're trying to get something from, then we're going to see that person leverage that relationship. How I ask my dad for money is not the same as how I ask an investor for money. And how I ask my dad for money is not the same as how you ask your dad for money, if indeed that is a thing that happens at all. And my point is, every relationship is unique, and the more pressure you put on that relationship, the more you learn about it. So you don't have to create circumstances to reveal any of this information whatsoever. People love to establish stuff in Act 1. Do not establish things. Don't set anything up. As crazy as this sounds, just let the protagonist set themselves up to succeed in Act 2. Let them do the work of making sure that their chances of success, once they expose themselves to the risks that they need to take, are as strong as they can possibly be. And we're going to find out who's important to them in this situation. We're going to find out what resources they have to bring to bear. We're going to find out exactly how much money they have and where it comes from, probably. Not because we're taking the time to explore those facts or circumstances, but because they are going to be leveraging the resources that they have. And if they don't wind up leveraging those resources, then they are not important to the story. You know what? This is a good time for me to bring up a point about the difference between literature and screenwriting. Literature is all about making effective observations. We put a character in a situation, and we dial that situation up so we can see how it affects the character. We're like laboratory scientists. And we observe that character, and we record our observations with as much craft and wit as we can manage. right? And we connect those observations with theme, right? The things that are happening to the character are thematically linked, and we increase the intensity of those themes on the character in order to boil their essence to the surface for the reader. Observation, really astute, good, deep, insightful observation, is the key to good literature and good journalism. It's not useful to us as screenwriters. Audiences, and this is going to sound so reductive, but it's 100% true. Audiences don't want our observations. Think about how mad people get about Hollywood making observations. They don't want our observations because they come to watch. They want to make their own observations. They don't want ours. The more we build the story around the observations we have to offer, the more we minimize the participation of the audience. The things that make literature so good make scene work inert, completely inert, and we just wind up, as I said, selling stuff to the audience. So, instead, we focus on what the characters are doing and how they do it. And the more challenging the action is, the more effort the character invests in what they're trying to do. Number one, the more we learn about them, and number two, the better the conflict is, because the more everybody else in that scene has to work to achieve their goals in turn, because everybody's on some level competing for the same resources. Even if those resources are esoteric, even if they're like time and attention, it could be anything. There's always something that two people need for different reasons, and only one person can have it. And that ends up being what the scene's about, is trying to make that work. And sometimes characters compromise and they wind up helping each other. There's all kinds of different ways. It's not just push and pull. It's not tug of war. These people have problem-solving abilities, or they don't, beyond that simple push and pull. But that's the essence of scene work right there. So you make a list of all the things that are challenging, mechanically challenging, externally challenging, that your character needs to accomplish to get from the beginning of the story to the point where they have nothing for it but to expose themselves to the risk and do the thing, whatever the thing happens to be. Make a list of those things. And then you write the scenes where they do that stuff. You write the scenes. That list is a scene list. That's the scene list between the beginning of the movie and the end of Act 1. So, you're going to take that scene list just of the first quarter of the film, and you're going to write each individual scene where the protagonist does that thing and where they overcome whatever conflict happens to be in their way. Okay? Scenes have a beginning and a middle and an end, just like the movie does. So, the scene that you're writing is the scene about the effort of the protagonist to accomplish the thing that they're trying to accomplish in that scene. Someone needs to recruit somebody to their team. They've got to convince that person to come join them. They're going to introduce... Now, so just like with the overall story, they're going to approach that person. There's a beginning. They engage that person, the first effort to bring that person into their team. And they're going to expose themselves to some risk, and things are going to get way out of control. They're going to overcome that risk and grow through it, find some deeper place to work from. It's the 3-act structure all over again, right? Because the escalation of conflict makes it inherent that things push to a breaking point, and then characters have to keep trying anyway. That's just the essence of action. That's the rise and fall of action. So a character goes into the scene trying to get this person on their team. They make their pitch. This other character has a goal of their own. They have something that they're trying to accomplish. It does not benefit from what the protagonist is suggesting until the protagonist makes it benefit from what they're suggesting. And the protagonist is going to push their angle until this other person finally has had enough of the distraction and needs to get back to what they're doing and shuts the door. And then the protagonist needs to find a new approach. 3-act structure. It's all effort. But through that effort, we're going to find out if there's a sense of debt in this relationship. The protagonist may or may not be the kind of person that would bring that debt up. We find out whether or not the protagonist is that kind of person. How a person pursues their goal tells us who they are. You don't need to establish anything. It's all going to be there on the screen if you just let it be. And you stay focused on the action, and you keep the action intense, by which I mean motivated and challenging. If no one wants to quit, and if it's never going to work, then everything's always pushing to the breaking point. And you learn, and you learn, and you learn. Now, there's one other thing to say here. You are going to be, because you're a writer, you're going to be tempted to outline all the way through the film. You're going to be tempted to make a list of all the things that the protagonist needs to do to work their way through the entire outline that you created during our last session. I urge you not to do that. I urge you just to write the things that they need to get to the end of Act 1 and then write the scenes. Because the truth is, if you do not give yourself too much structure here, your protagonist is going to be more resourceful. They're going to solve problems that you're not giving them credit for right now. They're going to build stronger relationships or more troubled relationships then you're giving yourself permission to imagine. And if you just let them do it, Act 2 is going to become a hell of a lot more rich and more interesting. And if the protagonist starts pushing the plot farther along than you reckoned with in your treatment, you have the flexibility to let them do it and just say, well, I guess the midpoint is a lot more drastic than I thought, and I guess the end of Act 2 is way more drastic than I thought, because here's where we are now, and they're going to be pushing that hard all the way along. You just let them move that needle. You see what I'm saying? Whereas if you have carted out all the little things that they need to do all the way through the end of the movie, you can't afford to let all those dominoes fall the second they get inventive or resourceful, and you start hamstringing the quality of your characters. So don't do that. Just Act 1. Make a list of all the things that they need to do that are challenging and demanding of effort. And then write the scenes where they do that stuff. And by the time you're done with this week's homework, you're going to be a quarter of the way through your new rough draft. And I'm going to tell you something else. Working from a place of action, you can already tell. It's a lot faster and more intuitive. It feels like you're not writing. It feels like you're not doing enough work. If you feel that way, you're doing it right. The truth is, you are doing the work, just not in the places that you're used to doing it. The how in how these characters pursue their goals, the essence of who they are, all of that is creative. The uniqueness of your characters and how they solve their problems, and the creative impulses that you're having about how your characters might go about certain things are coming from the characters that you've created. And the perspectives that they have and the experiences that they're coming from, the resources at their disposal, all of that stuff is stuff that you created. It's just that the writing itself is 2 steps removed from that in terms of cause and effect. All of that creation happened earlier in the chemical reaction than you're used to, and now you're watching the chemical reaction and you're trying to note the details of how that chemical reaction comes to a head, comes to an explosive end of Act 2. So don't be afraid that you're not doing enough work. You are. It's just that the creative aspects of this process are found in a different place than you're used to. Make a list of all the things your character needs to do to achieve their goal, and then write them doing those things. You will wind up, I'm sure, falling between page 22 and page 30. And I should at some point make a video about why screenplays are 120 pages or less, because it turns out there's some pretty valid reasons for that too. I'll make a video about that. But in the meantime, thank you for being here for the right stuff, and I look forward to learning with you. Have a good week.